Spring gardening in Florida brings lots of opportunities. And if you know when, what, and where to plant, you're going to have a lot of food growing in a really nice looking garden while you're at it. Let's be real, Florida's climate can be wild. I've been gardening in Florida since about 2013, and I've killed my fair share of plants, from early heat waves, surprise late frosts, super fast transitions between seasons. It's enough to make you feel a little bit crazy. I've learned a lot from my mistakes, and now I want to share them with you so that you don't make the same mistakes when trying to grow food in spring in Florida. First things first, let's identify cool season crops and warm season crops. Because in springtime, we can plant both of them to an extent. Some popular warm season crops that we can grow here in Florida are beans, cantaloupe, corn, cucumbers, eggplant, okra, peppers, potatoes, squash, tomatoes, and watermelon. That's a lot of warm season veggies. We can grow a ton of them here in Florida. So for cool season veggies, we're talking things like carrots, collards, lettuce, mustard, radish, and turnips. In just a few minutes, I'll talk about some of my favorite varieties of each of these vegetables. But before we get into that, let's talk about timing. Timing is everything. And depending on where you're at in the state, north, central, and south, our timing can be slightly different. Let's start by talking about the slow growing warm season veggies. These are peppers, eggplant, and tomatoes. In North Florida, you're going to want to start these as transplants in the beginning of February, so that in 6 to 8 weeks, you can then plant them into your garden. This will put you about mid-March to the beginning of April. In Central Florida, you're going to want to plant these as transplants in mid-December to early January, so that you can transplant them into your garden by mid-February to early March. If you're in South Florida, it's a little bit different for you. You don't have to worry about the fear of any frost. Really, what you're more concerned about is that intense heat showing up so early in the year. So really, your growing window is kind of this long window from August to March. So you don't really have to worry about starting these things as transplants and then moving them to your garden. You can actually direct sow them straight into your garden. Other warm season veggies like melons, cucumbers, squash, and beans that don't really benefit from transplanting can be direct sown into your garden as soon as the fear of the last frost is gone. Again, South Florida, don't really have to worry about frost, but Central and North Florida, we should figure out our last frost date. There's a lot of helpful resources online that can find that for you. My favorite one is Plant Maps. I'll put a link in the description. I'm in Central Florida, and according to Plant Maps, my last frost date is about the 20th of January. So I'm free to direct sow any seeds or transplants into the garden on or after that date. Although sometimes I do get a little squirrely and try to listen to my intuition and say, we're not going to get any more frosts. Maybe I try to plant them a little bit early. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so now let's talk about timing of our cool season veggies here in spring. We don't really have a big window or a lot of wiggle room for these things, so we need to focus on fast growing cool season veggies. As I mentioned earlier, that's things like lettuces, carrots, radish, turnips. In North Florida, you can get these into your garden as late as April. But in Central Florida, the latest you really want to get these things into your garden is March. If you're in South Florida, again, it's better to plant these later in the year, like November, October. But if you really do want to have some leafy greens growing in your garden in the springtime in South Florida, there's a lot of heat-tolerant leafy greens that we can grow. If you're trying to grow those traditional leafy greens, romaine, black-seeded Simpson, oak leek, like these really delicate leafy greens in South Florida in the spring, it's going to be really difficult for you. But choosing the right varieties is going to make your life so much better. Some heat-tolerant leafy greens that you can grow are Malabar spinach, Egyptian spinach, longevity spinach, and Ethiopian kale. These are some of my favorite heat-tolerant leafy greens that you can grow really in all parts of the state. I know I'm throwing a lot of info at you as far as dates and types of veggies that you can grow. If you want all of this written down, I'll put a link in the description to a free gardening guide that I put together. It lays all this out in a really nice, easy to read chart. So now that we know the right veggies to start and when to start them, let's talk about some of the best varieties to grow here in Florida. In Florida, we really need to focus on heat tolerant and disease resistant varieties. Our weather can be a little bit crazy. Like right now, it's 50 degrees. Yesterday, it was 80 degrees. But in general, we've got heat, we've got humidity, and we have a lot of pest pressure. So we need to choose plants that can take that. I'll start with tomatoes because I feel like tomatoes are the gateway vegetable. I feel like I've heard a ton of stories, and even myself included, wanted to grow my first vegetable garden. And it usually starts with a tomato. And honestly, tomatoes are probably not the best choice to start with if you're choosing just random varieties that you see at Home Depot or something. Tomatoes are pretty susceptible to pests and diseases, but there are a few tomatoes that I found grow really, really well here. And hands down, my favorite tomato is the Everglades tomato. I love Everglades tomatoes. They are these small little dime-sized cherry tomatoes. The plant itself can grow huge. It'll grow out of hand. I've had a plant that's 8 feet tall by 10 feet wide before. Should I have been pruning it? Maybe, but it was loaded with tomatoes. So many tomatoes on that thing. It just seems to outgrow any sort of pests or disease issues that I've seen with other tomatoes. So if you have the room and you haven't tried growing an Everglades tomato, I highly suggest it. Another really good tomato to grow in Florida is the Floridade tomato. This is actually a determinate tomato that was created at the University of Florida. So it's kind of built for our environmental conditions. Again, it is a determinate tomato, which means it's only going to grow to a determined size, unlike the Everglades tomato or any other indeterminate tomato, which will just grow wild and out of hand. Determinate tomatoes are great for people who have limited space, or maybe you don't have room for a trellis. Maybe all you have is a room for a couple of pots on a back porch or a front porch that gets a decent amount of sun. Determinate type tomatoes are great for you. Floridade is a great option. It makes a tomato about palm size, so you could even slice it up and maybe put it on a little Sammy or something like that. So Everglades and Floridade are my two favorite tomatoes to grow here in Florida. I also really love spicy things. I love to grow peppers, and I've grown a variety of peppers. Right next to me, I've got a chocolate habanero that's got a few peppers on it right now. I've grown just standard orange habaneros. I've grown sweet banana peppers. I've grown cayenne, ancho peppers. Pretty much you name it, and we can grow it here in Florida. Funny enough, the pepper I've had the most difficult time growing is just your standard green bell pepper that you would find at like Publix or something, I always tend to have the bottoms rot, or it just gets eaten up by bugs. So not that you can't grow it. There's plenty of other gardeners who have grown green bell peppers here. But I would suggest choosing something else. But pretty much with peppers, you're just limited to your imagination here. Eggplants are another fantastic one to grow in Florida. Right now in the garden behind me, I've got a Florida market eggplant. As the name suggests, it's well suited for us here in Florida. And actually, most other states in the United States grow eggplants as annuals, meaning they're just going to grow 1 year, produce, and then they're going to take them out of their garden. But here in Florida, we have very mild winters, especially central and south Florida. You can treat eggplant as a perennial. It'll continue to grow and produce for many, many years. This one behind me is now a year old. It did just get hit by this little chilly, cold front we just had roll through the state. So it doesn't look the best, but the plant is still super happy and healthy. In the next coming months, it's going to put on a lot of new growth, and I predict we're going to have a ton of eggplant this spring. Beans are another really fun one to grow here in Florida. They are super easy and they're fast growers. So if you're brand new to gardening, highly suggest growing some beans here in Florida. The varieties are pretty much limited to your imagination again. You can grow yard-long beans here. As the name suggests, the bean is about the size of a yard. 3 feet long beans is crazy. Right now in the garden, I've got Grandma Nellie's mushroom beans growing. Those beans are a nice pale yellow color, and they taste a little earthy, kind of like mushrooms. But a bean that I've grown for many, many years is called a provider bean. And it is just your standard green bean, super straightforward, nothing frilly or fancy about it, but it's just going to make you a lot of good green beans. Okay, Squash, another really fun one to grow. They come in a wild assortment. You can get crazy colors, crazy sizes and shapes, some of them even looking a little phallic. But really, what we're looking for in squash here in Florida are ones that are resistant to powdery mildew and the squash borer bug. I have those two things by far have killed more squashes than anything on me. So really, we're looking for squashes in the Moscata family. These squashes have a thicker vine, so it's harder for the squash borer bug to actually drill into it and damage the plant, or, eat it from the inside out. So squashes in the Moscata family. Let's talk about something of the same family as squash, and that's cucumbers. I've grown a lot of cucumber varieties here. Some of the best ones that I've grown are Ashley, Boston Pickling, and China Jade. Actually, a lot of the Asian type cucumbers do really, really well here in Florida. They are resistant to powdery mildew typically. They can handle higher humidity and heat, which makes them great for our climate here in Florida. For squash, cucumbers, and beans, you can either get these in a vining type or a bushing type plant. I always prefer to grow the vining type of these things because it maximizes space in your garden. Our gardens are in our front yard, and I do have room to trellis these things. But if you're really working with limited space and you don't have room for a trellis, totally look for bush varieties of these plants. So now let's quickly talk about some cool season varieties, things like carrots and lettuce. For carrots, I've had really good luck with scarlet nantes, red core championnet, and caratas. Carata carrots actually originated out of Japan, and they are built for high heat and humidity, which is us here in Florida. The carrots themselves, though, are a little bit stubbier than your nantes or your championnet type carrots. They're a little bit more rounded at the top. So they're not your traditional carrot shape. But if you've never grown a carota type carrot, I definitely suggest giving it a try. I think you're going to have a good time with it. Lettuces, just like beans, are pretty much limited by your imagination here. And this is for North and Central Florida growers. In the springtime, you can grow a decent amount of lettuces. Some of my favorite leafy greens to grow are Astro arugula, Mizuna mustard, black-seeded Simpson, and Ethiopian kale. Oh, don't forget Swiss chard. Love growing Swiss chard. It's got these really bright colors. You can get them in ruby red or rainbow colors, orange, yellow. It just adds a really nice touch to your garden. It looks super cool. If you're wanting to simplify your garden, I actually built a spring pack dedicated to Florida growers. It's got 13 different vegetables, all Florida-friendly varieties. I'll go ahead and put a link to that pack in the description as well if you're interested. Now, let's talk about some basic garden layout things that I seem to mess up all the time when I first started. And a lot of it can be solved with the power of observation. I can't underestimate this skill or say it enough. Observation in the garden is super powerful. You should take a look at where is the sun falling in your garden? How does the shade and the sunny spots move throughout the year? Are there certain plants that you have in multiple areas of the garden? Is one plant growing better than the other? Is your garden sloped at all? Is it collecting water in a certain area? Where's the wind coming from typically? All of these things are very beneficial tools. And the one thing that I think now, we've been in this house for about 3 years, our garden's in the front yard, I think I have the hang of it now, is the sun's positioning. It's something that I continuously underestimated, and I don't know why, but I just couldn't really grasp the shade and sunny spots for some reason. I've used a sun position app that kind of helps you. It shows you how the sun moves in the sky throughout the season. But if you have not paid attention to how the sun moves and where the shade in your garden kind of shifts throughout the year, highly, highly, highly recommend doing that. Draw a little simple map, take a picture of the garden at the same time and the same date every month. Maybe the first of the month at 10 a.m. What does your garden look like? That's going to be really, really helpful for your planning because most of these veggies need about 6 to 8 hours of sun. And a few of my garden beds in the springtime, it gets that. It gets 6 to 8 hours of sun. But during the fall time, some of those garden beds only get 4 hours of direct sun. So it can pretty drastically change your planning of your garden. So don't underestimate the sun's movement. A good general rule of thumb is to plant taller plants on the north side of your garden. So things that you're going to trellis should go north. Things that are a little bit less in front of that and a little bit less in front of that. So working towards your south. So southern end of your garden, smaller plants working towards the north end as the plants gradually get taller. Here's an example, little garden bed. If you wanted to start with a small 4x4 garden, which is what I started with, on the north side, I would maybe plant either beans or tomatoes. Something that's going to grow up pretty tall. A step in front of that, you could plant peppers perhaps. And then in front of that, working our way south, we can plant herbs or leafy greens. And that gives us this nice little stair-step action and make sure that all of these plants get an equal amount of sun. Another tip that you can follow is by growing trellised plants on the west side of your garden. Afternoon sun is a lot more intense than your morning and early afternoon sun. And by putting trellis plants on the west side, where all of that intense heat is going to come from, will provide a little bit of protection to your other more delicate plants. So if you wanted to grow a little garden, get another 4x4, west side, maybe trellis some beans, some squash, some cucumbers, and then working from west to east, now plant a bunch of leafy greens. Leafy greens, they can grow with 8 hours of sun, but they can also grow with 4 to 6 hours of sun. And by providing them with some protection from that west side sun, they're going to be a lot happier. And just because you want to grow veggies, don't let that be the only thing you grow. The more diverse your garden is, the better. So grow things like herbs and flowers. Some great herbs are basil, rosemary, thyme, sage. Some great flowers to grow in the garden are cosmos, sweet alyssum, and marigolds. And you can find those at pretty much any big box store. The more diversity, the better. There's actually more good bugs than there are bad bugs. So the more life that you can attract to your garden, the better your time is going to be, I promise. So now we've got a really good idea of when, what, and where to plant. Be sure to observe your garden. Introduce more and more plants. Don't just let it be veggies. You've got a really solid foundation to grow an amazing spring garden here in Florida. And again, if you want all of this written down, I'll put a link to a 100% free guide that I built dedicated for Florida gardeners, and I'll lay all of this out for you. I really hope this helps. Have a good day. Happy gardening.